Welcome back. A very thin margin separates U.S. presidential candidates Joe Biden and Donald Trump in uncalled states. Some projections say Biden is the winner in Wisconsin and Michigan, capturing 26 electoral votes and inching closer to the 270 he needs to capture the White House and deny Trump a second term. But as you've seen, my colleague Show and Bryce P say earlier on that different pollsters have different projections. But Biden's victory in the two states that were key parts of Trump's coalition in 2016 was significantly limited the president's pathways to re-election. We'll joined now by Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, who is Executive Director of the South African Institute of International Affairs, or SAIIA. Elizabeth, a very good evening to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I really appreciate it. So let's look at some of those projections. They're talking about the three all-important states of North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Is it really still a toss-up, or can we really read the writing on the wall at the moment?
Well, I suppose one can say that until all of the votes are in, one shouldn't call an election. And we've seen for all of those of us who are election fundis or election fanatics, all the sort of the different counties coming in. I think if we were to make a projection, if one was a betting person, one would clearly say that Biden was very much in the lead and had a solid lead, and things looked good. And the point that you've alluded to in your introduction, that he has more paths to the presidency than Donald Trump. And for a few hours now, we have seen him being solidly in the lead and also reducing the gap between him and Donald Trump in some of these key battleground states.
And including those are Arizona and Nevada that are being closely watched. The last time I checked, the projections were that he basically would have 17 votes of the 253 electoral votes that he's projected to have at the moment. He'd just have 17 to get to the 270 that's needed to get to the White House. Does it look more and more likely? Because I think the significance of the mail-in votes, I know there's a great deal of contestation, but for people to understand, is that happening in tandem? So if we're 98% in a particular state, does that include those?
Yes, it does. And obviously some states have started their counting 2 days ago by focusing on the mail-in and special votes, whereas other states like Pennsylvania only first started counting the votes of those people who had cast them on the 3rd of November, and only now are actually counting all of the mail-in votes. But that includes all votes cast, whether it's cast on the day or cast before the day.
Elizabeth, speaking about more strategic states like Pennsylvania, which you've mentioned, both stepped in the president's campaign managers saying they are obviously going to contest that. And I want to look at Wisconsin, for instance. That's permitted to, if a margin of victory is less than 1 percentage point, that Donald Trump can challenge that. What is the possibility of him legitimately doing that in some of those other strategic states, such as Pennsylvania and Michigan?
Well, I think the important, your observations are quite correct. The important thing to bear in mind, of course, when it comes to the American elections, is that every state has its own rules and regulations. So it's not like in South Africa, where you have an independent electoral commission, and everywhere across the country the same rules apply. Now, each state has its own particular arrangements and regulations around that. There is the possibility to contest the outcome where there are cases where there is evidence that there has been, something has not been done according to the rules, or there has been concern raised by some of the observers and so on, in the same way that we would have it here. And he is then fully entitled to question that and to use the legal processes in place to challenge and to show that something has not followed the correct and fair procedures. Now, each of these might differ. Clearly, some of the comments made over the last couple of days were, one should stop counting now. The results are in. Why change the results? Well, the results are actually in. Once all the votes that have been counted, and all the votes implies all the votes that are legitimately cast. So if you didn't like the ones that were cast by mail-in, well, as long as they were legal, you have to wait for them to be counted. So there are going to be legal contestations, and that's fine, as long as the processes and procedures are followed, and which is, I think, what the commitment everybody has made. That's to be expected. We've said this is not the first time that this would happen.
So, Elizabeth, obviously the world keenly watching these developments to see who the victor is, and I want you to give me your sense of how the world order, if at all, can change depending on who comes out of this, whether we're red or blue. I mean, just looking at some of the headlines in China, they were apparently just poking fun, saying that the US elections are very embarrassing. It's a contest between two geriatrics. In Russia, it said a pro-Kremlin news organizations are really pushing the possibility of violence. And if you look at what's happening in countries like Germany, some are saying crazy Trump, American catastrophe. So just give us your sense of what a Biden presidency would mean for the world order and vice versa for Trump being re-elected.
So I think it's important to note that the last 4 years under President Trump have brought significant changes to the international system, and we're unlikely to go back to where we were before January 2017. I think that's a fair point to make. And it's not just because of President Trump. I think there have been lots of dramatic shifts in power in the world, not least in the way in which China perceives itself, and also in the way in which China believes now that it can also begin to be much more assertive and project its influence. All of those are not going to change. What has been, I think, quite destabilizing and worrying is the fact that the normal way in which diplomacy and multilateralism is conducted has been flipped on its head under this Trump administration. And so everybody has had to recalibrate and see how one both responds to the global superpower, but also how one doesn't allow the entire multilateral system, which actually the US helped to create, to collapse. Now, the multilateral system needs reform. We all know that. And South Africa has been at the forefront of arguing for that. But you also don't want a wholesale collapse where then it becomes the rule of the most powerful. So with a Biden presidency, I think you're likely to see a recalibration towards a more normal type of diplomatic activity, as well as a greater, I think, commitment to the multilateral system and to the institutions, whether it's the WHO, the UN, the WTO, and so on. But we mustn't think that a lot of the debates that we have seen in the during the Trump administration, that these are going to disappear in the American system. So the issue around trade and the fact that they have not agreed to go with the consensus in the WTO with the African candidate, the Nigerian former Minister of Finance of Nigeria. It will be interesting to see how a Biden presidency responds to that. But I think you'll see them more engaged in the UN. You'll probably see them return to the WHO and hopefully to the Paris Climate Accord, which is critical. I mean, many of the American states have actually followed the Paris Accord, and I think it's a great pity that in fact a couple of days ago, the US formally left the Paris Accord after 4 years.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time and your insights as well. Very much appreciated. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos is Executive Director of the South African Institute of International Affairs, or SAIIA. And coming up, we'll ask Basil Manuel of the National Professional Teachers Organisation of South Africa about day one of the matric exams and the challenges of writing exams mid-pandemic. Francis will be bringing you that in just a moment.